China is counting on its world-beating export machine to help pull it out of its economic slump.
But that strategy is being complicated by a wave of tariffs, and it's not just the usual suspects in the West. So far this year, several developing economies have taken action against what they believe is China's overcapacity.
From electric vehicles in Brazil to textiles in Indonesia, Beijing faces new trade barriers in the global south. Many believe China is exporting too much and importing too little. The country generally has a strong trade surplus, which means it exports more than it imports. But throughout 2024, that surplus has been increasing dramatically. Exports have been rising fast, while weak domestic demand means imports have been stagnant all year. In June, China's trade surplus hit $99 billion, a monthly record. In this episode, we will look at what soaring Chinese exports mean for countries seeking to build up their own manufacturing bases and emulate the success which has made China an economic superpower.
And we ask if tariffs will simply become the new normal in China's relationship with the world's biggest emerging economies.
Welcome to Business Beyond.
Overcapacity. What exactly does it mean? The term is controversial because who decides when capacity has been reached? And why does it tend to primarily only focus on China?
To answer these questions, I spoke with Camille Boulenois from the Rhodium Group, an independent research organisation. She's part of their China projects team and she studies the country's economic system in detail.
The term itself has become a bit of a buzzword in Europe and in other countries when it comes to China, but it's a very loosely defined concept and there's no formal definition, which also means that the metric used to describe it are a bit up to debate and contentious. And of course, China doesn't acknowledge that it has overcapacities.
Fundamentally, overcapacity here is the idea that China produces too much for its domestic consumption and much more than normal market forces would allow.
The core underlying issue is the growing domestic imbalance within China's economy between demand and supply, which has massive spillover effects on the world. And very simply, what happens is that in recent years, we've seen a very fast increase in China's production capacity, which was fueled by state support. And at the same time, domestic demand has been very weak and couldn't absorb all that growing production capacity.
However, Kyle Chan, a researcher in Chinese industrial policy at Princeton University, says that from China's perspective, this is not overcapacity, but rather the country wanting to export as far and widely as possible, an aim shared by many economies.
It would be surprising for any country, and you've seen this, historically in the U.S. And much of Europe. It would be surprising if you have the ability to do so, to not try to reach beyond, especially if your home market, no matter how big it is, there'll be some limit.
As for the view of the Chinese Communist Party, a good insight into its perspective can be found on the international section of its official website. An opinion piece, purportedly from a Beijing-based commentator called Vox South, was published in May 2024 under the headline, "Accusation of China's Overcapacity, the Global South just doesn't buy it." It argues that talk of overcapacity is just another China threat theory, trumped up by a handful of Western media and politicians. Focusing in particular on Chinese green energy exports, including electric cars, it says China's production capacity creates better lives for the global south.
However it's framed, domestic Chinese problems are central to the issue. Its economy has not recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic or the property crash which recently hit the country. The government is trying to revive growth, but demand remains very weak.
China is running out of options to grow its economy, and the only way it has left is through more and more exports. In fact, I think we wouldn't be talking about overcapacity if China's economy was growing as fast as the Chinese government says that it is.
But the upshot of China's changing trade patterns is that it has dramatically increased its overall stake in global manufacturing.
Between 2019 and 2022, China has increased its share of global manufacturing exports by 3.5 percentage points, which is quite enormous. I mean, for a country of the size of China, which accounts for about a third of global manufacturing, it's really a lot.
But this all appears to be coming at a potentially serious cost to Beijing.
China remains by far the world's biggest exporter, with massive annual export values approaching 3.6 trillion US dollars. But it faces major trade barriers from two of its biggest economic partners, the US and the EU, particularly on electric cars. That has led Beijing to seek to strengthen trade relationships with a whole range of developing economies, from India to Indonesia, Mexico to Brazil, Vietnam to Thailand. But these economies too are starting to erect their own barriers as booming Chinese exports begin to put pressure on their own manufacturing sectors. Brazil and Turkey have put levies in place on electric vehicles to prevent their domestic markets being overrun and partly to encourage Chinese investment in building production plants locally. Brazil has also placed tariffs on steel, while India, Indonesia, Thailand and South Africa have put up barriers aimed at countering Chinese exports across a whole range of sectors, from steel to textiles to solar panels. It's easy to understand why they have taken such actions when we look at some recent trade data. We took a selection of the biggest developing economies, focusing on some of the global south countries we just mentioned. Here's how China's trade surplus with this selection of major emerging economies has developed over the last decade. From 2014 to 2019, there was little change, but since the pandemic ended, China's trade surplus with the selected economies has widened dramatically. It's now almost double what it was as recently as 2020.
On one level, this is a story about developing economies seeking to protect their own jobs and local industries from turbocharged Chinese competition.
We asked Henry Gao, Professor of Law from Singapore Management University with a specialisation in Chinese trade, to explain more.
For many different countries, they are concerned with the influx of Chinese exports because China is much more competitive than these countries in manufacturing these products, especially the low to middle end of consumer products. I mean, no country can compare against China. Chinese products are typically of better or at least a comparable quality and much cheaper. And these would mean that the local firms cannot compete.
But that's not the full story of China's economic relationship with these developing economies.
Collectively, they haven't really lost market shares to China. In fact, to some extent, they've been using cheap Chinese inputs to power their own manufacturing industries and to make products that they then export to the world, especially in some sectors where they are currently developing their production capacity.
For decades, emerging economies have benefited from cheap Chinese imports, often to power their own manufacturing sectors, and that remains the case.
It's especially true in ASEAN countries. So think of Vietnam, for example, is a very good case where it's almost one-to-one. It's importing inputs from China and then, making products at home that it then re-exports to the world. But you see that pattern in many different countries, really. India, Mexico, Turkey, etc.
Some experts say that the narrative of China being targeted with a wave of tariffs from developing economies is overblown, and that in many examples, it's a case of countries trying to protect specific sectors whilst also trying to attract investment in high-tech industries.
There have been some really prominent stories, really prominent cases. So you have Indonesia throwing out some very large tariff increases. But in that case, if you drill down, a lot of that's about protecting their textile sector, for example. You have Brazil, which has a scheduled sort of ramp up in tariffs on goods like electric vehicles. But you see that if you drill down as a paired approach to trying to attract Chinese investment. And you have actually quite a bit now, including a BYD plant that will be that's supposed to reach something like 150,000 vehicles per year capacity.
That's a key part of this story. The world's biggest developing economies, such as India, Indonesia, Brazil, and Vietnam, in many ways want to emulate China's economic success. But it's a difficult balancing act between fending off Chinese competition, trying to attract investment from the country, and avoiding becoming too dependent on it.
To better understand the complexities of China's economic relationships with the Global South, I spoke with Lina Ben Abdullah, an associate professor in international relations at Wake Forest University who specialises in this topic.
We've used the phrase Global South quite a lot in this programme, but it's not a term that everyone agrees on. So I asked Lina for her view.
At a very surface level, when someone says Global South, if we imagine this to be a geographical category, then we have several questions about Australia, about Japan. Are these in the Global South? Are these in the Global North? But I think a better way to define the Global South would be to actually think about it as not a geographical concept, but it is a concept that historically gestures towards communities and polities and groups of people who have struggled with issues of colonialism, issues of inequalities and injustices imposed by a global order.
As for China's own relationship with the Global South, there's considerable complexity and nuance.
China play on two different identities. It is a power that frames itself as a member of the Global South. So when it's actually talking in its diplomatic relations with members of the Global South, it speaks as it is part of the Global South. And it brings up sort of this shared history, shared past for China and several countries in the Global South for basically struggling with colonialism, having similar pasts and histories around those struggles.
But China also plays on its economic might when cultivating these relationships.
The second identity that China plays in its foreign policy is that it is the second largest economy in the world. So it becomes a source of aspiration for several countries in the Global South to see what China was able to achieve in the last 30 and 40 years becomes really an attractive model, an attractive example to follow and to kind of aspire to become as well.
Trade has been central, while its Belt and Road Initiative, a huge infrastructure investment drive, was another way in which China sought to win hearts and minds in developing economies. However, that appears to have run out of steam, with many host countries left saddled with debt, leading to protests and discontent in Kenya and Sri Lanka, to name two recent examples. But direct Chinese outbound investment is surging to record levels, a sign that the country is increasingly choosing to invest in manufacturing operations abroad, particularly in clean energy, as part of its way of dealing with new tariffs.
In many ways, this represents sort of a second chance at winning over the support of the Global South in a way that the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, turned out to be, perhaps at best a mixed result.
But it's not clear how sustained this type of investment will be, given China's domestic economic problems.
There are constraints because, first of all, the Chinese government might not want to let all these companies invest abroad and create jobs abroad when there is a huge unemployment problem in China. And so if you relocalize everything abroad, it will just worsen that problem.
To better understand how major economies in the Global South face the challenge of China's surging exports, let's look at two of the biggest examples, India and Brazil. Starting with India. Few countries exemplify the complex balancing act of competing and collaborating with China better than the world's most populous nation.
Under Narendra Modi, India has sought to expand its own relatively modest manufacturing base through its Make in India program. Part of that has seen the country place heavy restrictions on Chinese imports and investments.
India represents perhaps the most explicit sort of rivalry economically in terms of the sectors they're going after, in terms of parallel industrial policy programs. India has these production-linked incentives trying to boost investment and manufacturing capacity in areas like consumer electronics, and is trying to attract investment from outside China.
But China's trade surplus with India is widening dramatically. Since 2020, it has more than doubled to around $100 billion.
But it's a complex picture. While some Indian sectors, such as steel, have suffered at the hands of cheap Chinese imports, others are heavily dependent on Chinese intermediate goods for downstream production in India, and they value the low prices.
To better understand the dynamics, we spoke to two experts with detailed knowledge of China-India economic relations: Sushant Singh, lecturer in South Asian Studies at Yale University, and Nandita Rajhansa, an economist at Marcellus Investment Managers in Mumbai.
One is electronics, the other is solar power, the other is pharmaceuticals, then it's electric vehicles. And also in these sectors particularly, and certain manufacturing goods like infrastructure products, India is heavily dependent on China, not only for the final products, but also for intermediate products.
Now, because of the implosion of the Chinese economy, as we all know about it, the prices are as close to earth as they have ever been, or even below underground, actually. So they're as low as anyone has ever seen for all these materials. And as a result, they've been dumping naturally the products everywhere that they can. They have excess capacity and no one to consume it. So they've been dumping all of this material in countries like India, Vietnam, all the countries actually worldwide.
For Indian companies making the same intermediate goods, for example steel, cheap imports from China have been disastrous, but companies which need them for their own production welcome the imports.
They are procuring their raw material at a very low price. That means that input prices are really low, and as a result, their profits are much higher. So that's the reason why a few of the Indian companies which use Chinese products as their intermediate materials are doing really well.
Indian economic policy on China has been shifting, and not just because of dependence on certain cheap imports. While the country wants to reduce that dependence, there's a growing belief that India needs to become more aligned with China in certain areas to achieve its own manufacturing and economic ambitions.
There's been a lot of talk from the government in India that we need to integrate ourselves with the Chinese supply chains. We need to get Chinese experts. We need to get Chinese technology, and we need to get Chinese investments. We need to get these China plus one companies which are moving out of China into India to boost Indian manufacturing over the next 5 to 7 years.
He says India is courting Chinese investment in 3 areas which it views as vital to its economic development.
It's very clear that the government is really courting Chinese companies in electronics, whether it is mobile, whether it is laptop, all the whole electronics, the whole gamut of electronics sector. The second is the solar power cells. The third is the electric vehicles.
Yet the China-India relationship, both economically and politically, fundamentally remains one of rivalry, which complicates how the picture will develop.
A large number of Indian think tanks, scholars, retired diplomats have raised questions, economists have raised questions about whether this is the right course to take. Going along with China, integrating yourself to the Chinese supply chains, asking for Chinese investment to come, is this really going to help India in the long run, considering the geostrategic environment, the geopolitical environment in which India operates? It would in fact end up strengthening China, increasing China's power, allowing China to deal with its overcapacity problem and the excess investment that it has. And a lot of people have said that, are you helping China, or are you going to help India in this case?
How India balances its growing dependence on Chinese imports and its need for Chinese investment with its own desire to build up its manufacturing base will be closely watched.
Not least by another major global economy with a similarly challenging balancing act: Brazil. Like India, Brazil is a member of the BRICS group with China. With a population of more than 200 million people and one of the top 10 economies in the world, it's a crucial partner for China. Yet unlike India, Brazil actually has a trade surplus with the country. Brazil is a major commodity producer, and through exports such as soybeans and iron ore, it has long enjoyed a trade surplus over China. In recent years, even with China widening its overall global trade surplus, its deficit with Brazil has gotten bigger. And Brazil has been one of the most active countries in countering Chinese exports through tariffs recently, imposing levies on steel and electric vehicles. To understand how Brazil navigates its evolving but critical economic relationship with China, we spoke to Larissa Vackholz, who leads the China Analysis Group at the Brazilian Center for International Relations.
she emphasises that despite the recent tariffs, the countries enjoy a positive economic relationship.
Brazil has really benefited from China's rise as a global economic superpower. So Brazil is one of these countries that, because of the nature of its exports to China, mostly commodities, really benefited from the fact that China started demanding commodities on a regular and sustained basis.
But like with India and the many other countries with concerns around Chinese overcapacity, it all comes back to the idea of protecting domestic manufacturing and employment.
Brazil is a big country with a big population of about 200 million people, and obviously the best jobs are created in the industry, so we really have a concern to be able to maintain our industrial park going forward.
Brazil has concerns over Chinese export competition and dumping in multiple sectors, from steel to chemicals, tyres to electric vehicles. But Chinese car makers BYD and GWM have invested in major electric car plants in the country, a sign of both sides' eagerness to find a way forward.
Brazil as a country has been trying to address that with China in different ways, but you can think about the opportunities that are created by the different industrial chains and supply chains created by the ecological transition or the energy transition. So Brazil is already a major destination for Chinese direct investment in the world.
The Brazil example shows how imposing tariffs on China can be part of a strategy to attract investment, develop domestic industry, and create and protect jobs.
So that changes even the perspective that China has about Brazil's concerns. I think Brazil's concerns are very clear in terms of what we are worried about. And this is very important because when you come from a perspective of trying to protect your own ability to create jobs and well-paying jobs that industries are able to create, there is no misunderstanding about what your intentions are.
The question we posed at the outset of this programme was whether the current wave of tariffs aimed at China from some developing economies signalled the start of a wider clash.
There's little doubt that some developing economies, particularly in the global south, feel China's current strategy is creating a serious challenge.
The Chinese government explicitly refuses to let go of lower-end manufacturing. So the labor-intensive sectors, I'm thinking of textile, for example, of furniture, etc., that considering China's rising labor costs really should go elsewhere, should go to third countries. But they are incentivized to stay in China, in part because of state subsidies. And that prevents a lot of emerging countries from becoming major players in those sectors and then using those sectors to move up the value chain.
It is inevitable that these countries will move up the value chain, right, and get into more sophisticated manufacturing activities. That is what happened in China. Nowadays, it can manufacture many high-end products like cell phones and computers. So China has to realize that it cannot just continue exporting to these countries. It should try to promote local manufacturing capacity.
Yet many developing economies believe they need both Chinese imports and direct investment to achieve their central economic aims.
The idea is not to shun China. Idea is not to, decouple from China in a certain sense. The idea may be to some extent de-risk from China, but those capacities currently do not exist in India. So the broad idea is that we need to work with China. We will be very careful while doing so, but we'll need to work with China.
China will always be viewed as a rival and always at the same time as a development model to emulate. So I think that these two will always exist side by side. For some countries, the rivalry will outweigh the cooperation, and for other countries, it's going to be the other way around. But I think rivalry is always going to be there.
It's a high-wire balancing act. But for the emerging economies of the global south, walking that line without tripping up may hold the key to their economic success.
And that's all for this episode of Business Beyond. If you want to see more of our episodes, you'll find our playlist in the video description. Thanks a lot for watching, and until the next time, take care.